Welcome to Flying Minds, where we dive into the stories, passions, journeys of aviation's most fascinating minds. I'm your host, Stephen Grisbrook, and today we're joined by an extraordinary guest, Ian Gracie. Born and raised in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, Ian's aviation career kicked off on the docks and in the cockpits of float planes, flying everything from Cessna 185s to single otters, just 400 hours under his belt. From the rugged northern skies with outfits like Pinehouse Airways and Points North Air to captaining Boeing 737s at WestJet, Ian's logged a career as dynamic as the landscape he's flown over. But Ian's story goes far beyond the flight deck. A recovering alcoholic who found sobriety in 1999. He's been a trailblazer in supporting pilots facing substance use challenges. As one of the architects of WestJet's pilot recovery program and the visionary behind Aircrew Recovery Canada, Ian's work has transformed lives across the industry, now as he focuses on leading Aircrew Recovery Canada. He's also a certified Bikram yoga teacher, an avid trail runner, and a proud Canmore resident sharing life with his Alaskan Malamute, Atka. Join us as Ian shares his incredible journey full of grit, redemption, and a lifelong love for flying. This is Flying Minds, so buckle up tight because you're in for a ride. Where are we? All right. Mr. Gracie, Ian Gracie.
Sir.
Thank you for joining me on Flying Minds today.
Thank you for having me here.
I know you're, well, maybe you're not a busy man, but you have a busy schedule, I know, with flying and Aircrew Recovery Canada and probably all the hikes you do in Canmore. So
It is a little bit busy, but to some degree self-inflicted. So,
well, that's good. So Flying Minds is very fortunate to have you on here, and we're going to get into some, I know, a real good conversation here.
Absolutely.
Your story spans, or your flying story spans 39 years roughly?
30, I think it's 36 now. But yeah.
36?
Yeah, I'm not very good at math, but
Yeah. Maybe I didn't carry the one or I forgot to add the one or something.
entirely possible.
And I want the listeners just to get an idea of who you are. So can you introduce yourself as if someone else were describing you, and what would they say about your journey and who you are?
It's probably a dangerous question, but from my perspective, born and raised in La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan. Mother immigrated from England, dad from Scotland. And they were married for about 12 years, which resulted in myself and my younger brother, Ken. The growing up in La Ronge and running around in the bush and canoeing and fishing and all that sort of thing is sort of, that's where I find a lot of my peace even now, is being in the bush. My dad was the resident geologist in La Ronge for 39 years, roughly. He's just passed away April of this year.
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And according to my mother, I popped out of the womb arguing. So I don't know. That's how my dad would describe it.
I have one of I have a boy like that.
Yeah. I'm like, but my dad used to go out in the bush, and being the resident geologist, he would go to the mining camps and he's looking at core and he's looking at property maps and all that sort of thing. And I used to go, when I was a little bit older, I went with him. And I really enjoyed the airplane ride, and I did not enjoy walking through the bush for 3 hours to look at a rock. The pilot got back in the airplane, the pilot went home, and I'm like, well, that's a crafty devil, eh? But I was always enchanted by the airplane for some reason, which I don't think I could really explain that. I don't think I still can't. But
How old were you?
8, 10, something like that. I started to go out in the bush with him.
Okay.
I think. And it was also a sort of a point, I think, though I didn't realize until years later, a point of bonding between my dad and I is that we got to talk about the airplane stuff, right? Because we were conflicted otherwise in many ways. But I would go out in the bush with him, and then it just sort of stayed with me all the way through high school. I was always talking about airplanes. It's really the only thing I knew I wanted to do. And, I remember when I graduated high school, my dad came at me with this huge stack of paper, and I said, what's that? He said, those are your university admission papers. And I said, I'm not going to university. And he said, yes, you are. And so a little battle ensued, and I wound up at the University of Saskatchewan. I agreed to a year there, and he agreed to let me do my private pilot's license.
Oh, there you go.
And
It's a good trade-off.
well, it was a good trade-off until, when I was in high school, I'd been working the dock for a guy named Ray Cameron at Don Air. Um, and I loved that job, but I was, when I was a young guy, after my parents divorced, I gained quite a bit of weight. So I was quite a heavy young guy. I'm pretty sure Cameron fired me every day without fail. And, but the winter that I was at U of S in 1987, he called and said, well, if you have your commercial by spring, I'll give you a 185 to fly. And that's about all I needed to hear. And I phoned my dad and I said, well, that's about enough of this crap. I'm going to go fly airplanes now. And I hung up before he could respond. So that's kind of how things went.
Hang on. You were in Saskatoon?
Yeah.
And where was he when you?
Larange.
In Larange.
Yeah.
Well, there's some pretty good distance there. Couldn't come and boot you in the ass.
Well, no, but I think that my poor brother got the brunt of that because I think there was a thundering down the hallway and a bursting into my brother's room saying, "You're going to university, right?" So my brother tells that story the best, but that's how I grew up, and it was, a split household and back and forth, which I found a little bit stressful and all that sort of thing. But yeah, most of my adolescence was, was an overweight kid being bullied and, didn't date, I had trouble interacting with other people. Trust was a big problem. And then, I left Larange and, well, I flew 185 at Larange, partly dockhand 185 pilot for summer of 88. And then I left the following year and started heading off to other jobs and other places. And
yeah. And that took you to, what was the next airline? Was it Wollaston?
no, I went, the fall that I quit in 1988, I had disagreement with the boss, and he had one perspective and I had a different one. And so I quit, and really, I think unfortunately at that time I was, what had happened when I was a kid, I was, not because, but the elemental parts of the story, overweight, being bullied. I had really low self-worth, low self-esteem. I tell people when I tell my story that the only thing I remember feeling when I was a kid was fear, anxiety, shame, and anger. But if you'd stopped me and asked me what that was all about, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I didn't know. And in fact, I thought everybody felt that way.
Right.
Until something took place, and that is I had my first drink.
And at what age was that?
I was 16. The first time I had a drink, I felt all that stuff melt. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I feel different. I feel more confident. I feel, I didn't even know it was possible to feel differently. I just assumed that this is how everybody feels all the time.
Right.
And so, I had taken that drink. I found this sort of new way of being. But, the problem, and where this connects back to where we were, is that my whole identity was wrapped up in being a pilot, because it's the only thing I'd ever experienced in my life that had given me some sort of identity or self-worth. And so when I had this disagreement with his boss in 88, I was, what was I? I was 19, I think, when I quit. I went on unemployment insurance versus get any other sort of job because I was heavily invested in this idea that I was a pilot. And so I can only take a pilot job.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
And, my mother, well, I know my dad had an opinion about that, and my mother had an opinion, but my mother's there's a lot of grace came from my mother over the years. And I think other people thought, well, that's a bit sort of an arrogant, hot-headed position. And knowing what I know now, they weren't wrong, actually. But I just didn't agree with that perspective at the time.
Oh, well.
Right.
You're 19 years old. You're not supposed to agree. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to do.
Right. So I went on unemployment insurance, and then I was flying a 172 on wheels, kind of under the table for a local guy hauling deer meat off. I think it's Little Delarond Lake, kind of southwest Larange.
I don't know that area.
Yeah.
You could tell me and I'd go, okay.
Yeah. It's either Delarond or Little Delarond. I can't remember clearly, but that's what I was kind of doing. And then the spring of 88, I believe I hijacked my mother's credit card and jumped in my car and disappeared into Manitoba, Northwest Ontario, driving around looking for a job. And, met a lot of different people, I remember being in, I think, Red Lake, and one of the chief pilots came out. I had 250 hours or, 50 hours in floats. And he said something like, "Oh yeah, where do you think you're going to get hired with that?" And I said, "Well, clearly not here." So I left. But I was very fortunate. I got hired by Parsons Airways in Flin Flon.
Yeah.
And there was a guy named Bob Ferguson, and he'd been, Parsons Airways went way back in history. And, I got hired there to fly 185. And then another fella came shortly after I got hired. There was, I think, 4 or 5 of us flying that summer, single otters, 185s.
And this was late 80s.
89, summer of 89.
Okay.
Yeah. And I had been brought up, although I was overweight and I was kind of, everything I touched turned to crap in some fashion. I'd been brought up, I think, with a really strong work ethic through my dad and through Ray Cameron as well. Like I tried to work as hard as I could. And I knew that, if you were sort of slacking or useless, you basically people got rid of you. That's how it worked.
Right.
And so like I spent, we would show up early, we'd make sure the airplanes were clean, everything was ready to go if a trip came. And I think that employer had experienced a period of time where pilots weren't doing that. They just, didn't really care about the job, didn't care about the airplane, didn't care about the employer. And so he saw in myself and the other guy that was hired that summer, the other 185 guy, a bit of a change around that. And he would sit us down and tell us that, like, this is weird. You guys actually take care of the airplanes. You're on time, you're early, you're all these sorts of things. So that's where my sort of upbringing in L'Orange and the guys that I had worked for, that's where that came from. And then I was in the hangar. I remember this day very clearly because I had all of 400 hours. And Bob Ferguson, the boss, comes out of the office and says, "Gracie, you want to fly the Otter?" I was like, I only have 400 hours, right? You want to fly it or not? Yes.
Good answer.
Right? So they sent me to Lynn Lake, trained me on the Otter, and cut me loose. And I was like, holy mother. And I phoned guys back in L'Orange. I said, they put me on the Otter. They cut me loose in the Otter, single pilot. They're like, yeah, well, it's doable. Just like be really careful. Right. So I listened to all that advice and I had a couple of, self-induced heart attacks through the summer, but it was a really good summer. And I really enjoyed working for that outfit. But in, I don't know, it was late August, September, we're all sitting around with the boss having coffee in the morning and there's 3 or 4 airplanes tied to the dock and 4 K cars rolled into the yard and they all said Transport Canada on them.
Dope.
So I'm like, I think summer's over, boys. Yeah. And within an hour, everything at the dock was grounded and they basically shut them down. The maintenance was a little bit sketchy, perhaps. Yeah.
That's probably a good word.
Yeah. So that was unfortunate, but yeah.
Okay. So you went from there, they shut down. Then where did you go after that?
Well, I did my roommates were flying for Jackson Air for Bill Jackson. So I did a quick 1-month contract on 185 on skis and 206 on wheels. And then I left in the spring. I remember it being March, April, and went to Northway Aviation, just north of Winnipeg, and flew kind of a 6-week deal on a 206.
Right. Great airplane.
Yeah, I like that thing. And then I wanted to go back to Saskatchewan, and I got hired by Points North Air. So I got based out of Points North Landing. I'm not entirely clear. I think I got hired to fly the Beaver, maybe. I don't remember. But I got there, and they started training me right seat on the DC-3. And I decided it was entirely too big in there. You can get entirely too much stuff in here. But I was still kind of really interested in flying the Otter. So then I ended up flying 185 Beaver Otter. I think I got checked out in the 402. I don't remember line flying it, but and I was there for about 2 years when I had a gear leg collapse on a single Otter. I was hauling fuel into Hatchet Lake. And there's 2 versions of the story. I'm not sure which one's real. One says that I quit and the other one says I got fired. I'm not sure.
Well, I guess it would depend on whether you actually said I quit before they said you're fired.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a clear memory of that. What I remember thinking is that they think I quit and I think you fired me. So I don't know how that went, but
regardless, you didn't stay there.
I didn't stay there. But the other Otter pilot that I was rotating against, Pat Charche, bought Eagle Air and Walson Post that same spring. And as soon as he heard I got fired, he hired me, or I quit, he hired me, and I became his first pilot in Wollaston.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long were you there?
Wollaston Post for 2 years, a little over 2 years, I think. That was like early spring 92, I went there. And then August 1994, Comair hired me for a 1-month contract rates on the King Air, which it was the test bed to see whether or not I was going to stay.
Right.
Comair, still to this day, even with 22 years at WestJet, my boss will not love, but Comair still hands down the best job I've ever had.
You know what? I'm sure there's a lot of people at different airlines that said, my best job was, that's not where you are.
I love WestJet. I still love flying for WestJet, but it's not, and as you know, jet flying is so different that you have to extract joy from that in a different way than the stuff we were doing before.
That's, I like the way you say that.
Yeah.
Extract joy in a different way. So what was it for you? Extracting joy flying the jet then?
Well,
let's go down that road.
When I had left First Air, so I'd gone from Comair to First Air, and I started out as an A-check on the Hawker for First Air, and then I stopped doing A-check training stuff, and they started to retire the Hawker, and they were getting these ATR 42s, and I didn't want to fly it. I said, if I'm going to sit at 25,000 feet and I can't see anything, and I'm not really doing any grunt labor like I like to do, actually, then I might as well go fly a jet. And they said, well, you can bump onto the jet. And I said, yeah, but the First Air jet at the time, the pay in Yellowknife was not stellar. It goes to roughly the same 6 places, and it's so senior, you have to wait for someone to die to get an upgrade.
Was that on the 7-2?
No, that was a 37. I don't think I would have. I don't know if the 27s were still around by that time.
Because mutual friend of ours, somebody you worked with, First Air, Spud, I call him, Antonek. He was on the 7-2.
Yeah, he was. But when I got there in 99, the 27 was still really active. But my memory is by the time I left in 2002, it wasn't that active.
Okay.
I could be wrong because Spud had left by that time. This is my memory. But
sorry, what year was that?
Well, I left there in 2002.
Okay, no, Daryl joined us at Japan Airlines in 2000.
Yeah, so I think I could be quite wrong. Other guys would remember better than me, but I don't remember the 27 being that active at that point. Anyway, I left. The end of the story is I left First Air, got hired by WestJet, and I really had no interest at all in going south and flying jets. But I talked to a lot of my buddies, and they're like, oh yeah, it's a great place. It's fantastic. Come on down. And I got an interview fairly quickly and got hired fairly quickly as well. But when I started jet flying, I did not like it. And partially, though I worked, whatever we all worked, 24, 25 days a month, First Air, I was home every night.
Right.
And with jet flying, I was gone all of a sudden. And at the time I had a girlfriend and a dog, and I was like, I was homesick a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't know if I'm going to really, I don't know if this is for me. And I was one of the fortunate group that we got upgraded in 22 months I got hired on the 737-200. I really enjoyed the airplane, a huge learning curve for Ian. And, when I started, and I often tell this in my presentations, when I started at WestJet, when I started training into the 200, no jet time, no simulator time. I'm suddenly going 100 knots faster than I've ever gone before. No significant autopilot time. My simulator sessions on the 200 did not go well. The first 2 instructors, I still remember who they were. And I bet that was an unholy nightmare to try and train me. Because what happens to me is
I've seen a few of those.
Right? I have a training background, and I was an A-check. I don't know that I was a very good A-check, but I was an A-check. And I knew enough to know how badly this was going. I didn't need to get told. From the time I rotated the sim It was wingtip to 10,000 feet. No situational awareness
Oh boy.
at all. And I'm like, what is going on? I have 11,000 hours. I got all this training time. And so now I'm not only confused and frustrated, I'm scared. And as soon as I get scared, I get very aggressive. And I'm very difficult to talk to, let alone teach anything to.
Right.
And I was becoming very combative with the sim instructors. My winger, I think, was getting a little bit worried about where things were going. Right. And I tell this story all the time, and I call it the legend of Keith Drake. And Keith Drake is now a retired WestJet guy, but he was the third instructor to come into the sim. Didn't know Keith, didn't know anything about him. And he rolled into the sim and he let us go. And after about 15 minutes, the sim froze, or he froze the sim, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, there it is. There's the end of my WestJet career. And he leaned in and he said, what are you doing? And I said, I think it's pretty clear that I have no idea what I'm doing. And he said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, just first of all, sit back in the seat, let go of that death grip you got on the column there.
Yeah.
And just do these 6 things. Don't do anything else. To this day, I don't remember what the 6 things were, but I do remember that in 45 minutes, that guy had me completely turned around.
There you go.
I could fly the sim. I relaxed. Even my winger said to me, where did you come from? I was like, I have no idea. And so I credit Keith Drake. The reason I'm still at WestJet 22, 23 years later is because of Keith Drake. Not because he did something magical. It's simply that he knew what to do.
Right.
And he could see through all the fear and the aggression and the pushback and the combative nature.
Yeah.
It's like, I see the human being in there that's suffering and scared.
Yeah.
And I know what to do about that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
That's, we could go into, I don't want to digress into the training side of it, but you have a good instructor, you have a bad instructor, or an instructor. They don't even have to be bad. They just don't catch what you just said. They don't catch what's going on, right?
Yep.
And I've seen it in young guys when I was at WestJet Encore. I remember having a young lad, young East Indian kid, and it was the very first time he'd been in a simulator. His grin was like this wide.
Yep.
He was bouncing on his feet. Couldn't believe it. But he'd come from a job where he didn't have the hands and feet.
Yep.
Right. So it took him quite a while. So all I did was just get him to do some climbs and steep turns and descents and, until he felt comfortable with it. It took a few days.
Yep.
But, once he got him going, you couldn't stop him.
Yeah.
Right. Good kid. And as a matter of fact, I think he's either at Mainline right now or he's at Air Canada.
Awesome.
Yeah. Good kid.
But that's the thing, is that talent or that innate ability to see the person and hold the space. But it's difficult nowadays, I think, or maybe it's still then, but the sim scripts are so tight. There isn't really the time. So it's either you hit the mark or you don't, which is not, and I would never, like, aviation now is, and I have to assume it had to cycle through this same sort of busy, huge hiring uptake at some point in the past. I'm just not old enough to remember that. But, all these guys are getting in the jet right away. Good on you. But sometimes I think they're at a disadvantage because they're showing up with some of the skill sets that we cobbled together along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And it's never to say you can't do it, you shouldn't do it, but you just don't know what you don't know. Right?
Correct.
And I think sometimes it's unfair. But, my perspective of aviation is, it's not entirely accurate anymore, I don't think. But I would always say that given the same money and the same time off, I'd rather be in the Arctic flying Twin Otters than flying jets. Jets are kind of boring.
Yeah.
Right. But that's what I enjoyed. And these, in my presentations, I have a slide that says, pilot life. Are you actually in this? Do you have the passion for this, or you just think this is a really cool idea?
I'm glad you brought that up, and that was kind of the direction I was going to go later on, but, I like to run with it when I see it. how often do you hear of a flight school or, some of these smaller outfits? Do they say, do you know what you're getting into? Why are you here? Do you realize how hard it is? Do you realize, you're going to be gone a lot? Are you a person that likes to stay at home? Do you have, like to walk your dog every day? Well, in aviation, you have no idea where you're going to be sometimes. Could be gone for days, right?
Well, that's it. And I don't, I'm not an expert on different generations and things and how different generations see things, but purely observational instances in my own career, it's like when I started flying, what I felt I needed to bring to the table was sort of anything, anytime, anywhere. And when I came to WestJet, and I often describe this to guys, when I came to WestJet, it was really confusing at first because I would get a phone call that would say, "Do you want to go flying?" So well, any other phone call in my career prior to that was, "You're going flying." It's not a question,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? So, I friends that I've had non-aviation as I've been dating along the way, and friends of that person that I've been dating, the phone will ring and it's like, "Okay, I'm leaving. I'll see you in 4 days." And they're like, "Well, what do you mean?" I don't know how to explain that any differently. Like, I'm going to work. I'll see you in 4 days. Well, we got this planned. I was like, yeah, planned, not confirmed.
Sorry, I'm a pilot, right?
Right. So it doesn't work that way. So I think that, and I've heard anecdotal stories about, chief pilots getting phone calls saying, and the pilot on the other end is a brand new hire says, can you put on my file that I don't do red eyes, please? "What? You don't do red eyes?" No, enjoy your red eye. Like it's all part of what this is. Right.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if there's a disservice being provided in flight school promotional things, or if parents are pushing these guys to be something that actually the kid might not even actually understand what he's getting into. And they see the high income and they see the, quote unquote glamour that we all laugh about. Right. But the actual execution of a flying career over decades is a bit challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very blunt with the kids when I go into the flight schools. I say, look, if you have the passion for this, that's awesome. But there are going to be sacrifices along the way. And at the end of the day, you work for your employer and you're responsible to that employer. And it's not the Ian Gracie show. It's what WestJet needs from Ian Gracie in my service to that airline.
Right.
Right. Balancing out against, everything else, whether there's a contract present or what have you. But that's a huge point for me, is that I work for my employer.
Right. Well, it's a different world we live in right now.
Well, I think it is. And I don't know. And I think it's unfair of me to sit here at, crowding 56 years old and say to the guy that's 25 that, well, the way you see this is wrong. I don't think that's fair, but it's like, here's my perspective for you, should you choose to accept it. I think the path you're on might lead to a little bit of suffering for you, but maybe that's what you need to experience.
Did you say at the end of that, this tape will self-destruct
Right?
in 10 seconds?
Yeah, but the guys that I worked for in the bush instilled in me a lot of ethic and a lot of work ethic. And, I've been screamed at. It's like, you work for me. And I've done dumb stuff along the way as a young guy, thinking, I'm, king of the hill because I'm a pilot, that sort of thing. I've done those arrogant things, and I see later on, as you sort of mature and mellow a little bit, that was an arrogant thing that I did.
So, when we start talking about this sort of stuff and you mention something like that, I'm going to open that door.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Why?
So let's talk about what can you expand on some of the dumb things that you've done in this? Give us an incident or something that happened that may have
Well,
opened or closed a door.
Yeah, no. Well, I told you, like, I will literally answer anything you ask me. I just can't untell you. Right. So, and when I share my story widely, and even when I'm talking to, certain groups, I say, like, I'm going to try to share this in a way that doesn't lead to a mass cancellation of airline tickets, right? So,
Well, before you go down that road, and let me just share with the listeners that, what you hear today doesn't necessarily mean that it happens all the time.
oh,
And it doesn't mean that uh, this individual is unsafe or any of the airlines are unsafe. And I said in one of my podcasts, pilots are people too. We can suffer from the same thing that any industry does, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a plumber or an electrician or truck driver, doesn't matter.
yeah, and I think that's a really important point for anybody who's listening. I mean, it's, general public listening, there are people just generally interested in aviation, is that, I'm a recovering alcoholic. There are special meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous for pilots for that very reason, right? I don't need to go into a sort of regular rank AA meeting and start talking about things that I've done in the airplane, pre-recovery or even after recovery. That is disrespectful to the person who's listening, is disrespectful to the industry, to my employer, and to other pilots who may be suffering from this.
Right.
Right. It's the same reason there's special meetings for doctors, is like, and some regular rank of AA, they rub up against that a little bit. It bugs them, but it's like, listen, as a recovering alcoholic pilot, I don't need to hear a recovering alcoholic surgeon talk about all the whacked stuff he did when he was still sick or in early recovery.
Right.
At some point, I need to have faith and trust in these systems, for example, the programs that we run, to ensure that risk is minimized, but risk never goes to zero, right? So I think it's a really important point you bring up, because all over society, especially now, there's all this discussion and advertising and talking about, mental health and Bell Talks Day and all this stuff. And it's all really important to bring it up, talk about it. But everybody gets really wiggy when you start talking about, but it's a pilot. There's this weird idea that we are somehow superhuman and we don't have any problems. And even an employer will say insane things like, well, the pilot just needs to leave the problems at the flight deck door. I was like, well, that's a nice theory, but that's not what's actually happening.
Right.
Right. And so I think it's unfair for everybody, including the employer, to have that perspective. Is, like it or not, and this again goes back to jet flying, and you're sitting in 6 or 7 hours of soul sucking cruise. I can tell you that I'm not reviewing the fine intricacies of the electrical system. I'm thinking about my life, right?
Yeah. Oh shit! Here I was. Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
And pilots are, I think, I don't know if I could say particularly bad, but that's most of our exposure as pilots, right? Is that we ruminate on stuff. And my experience, and I've done it, I've watched myself do it, is that I will invent things to worry about, catastrophize off what I've invented, and then launch into black and white thinking / decision making on something that was never real in the first place. Right. It's all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, and I remember going across to Hawaii one night and I was spinning on this problem. I was thinking, I don't know how to solve this. And I managed to solve it through crew scheduling or something with the A cars. I was like, I think I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can just think about, and then I watch myself pick something else out of thin air and worry about that all the way.
What do you think causes that?
Well, I think human nature, we tend to fill a void or a vacuum with something. It's better to have some piece of information or worry, even if it's manufactured in there. But I think we have a hard time sitting in silence and sitting in peace because it's uncomfortable.
Well, that being said, though, pilots do suffer in silence. They don't like to tell anybody that they're hurting.
I don't know. I hear that a lot, and pilots, I would argue that pilots don't like to suffer in silence. What happens, and it certainly happened for me, is that who am I going to tell? Who am I going to tell that's not going to ruin my career? The common phrase that goes on is I don't want to lose my medical, even though at point of fact, it's not mine.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the language we use, right? So I think it's less about, it wasn't that I wanted to suffer in silence. I was just like, I don't trust anybody. I'm scared of everything. I'm full of anxiety. I'm angry. I'm fearful. Who am I going to tell? Because if I tell anybody, I'm going to lose all of the things that define who I am.
Right.
And if I'm not who I am, and on top of that, if I have to actually look at who I might be, and or I might have to consider surrendering the medical for a period of time, but if I got to surrender the medical and I can't be a pilot, then that's the only thing that I am. So I might as well kill myself.
When did you first notice that um, uh, alcohol was a significant part of your life?
Well, it's an interesting question, right? Because when my parents divorced, my mom lived with a guy who is in AA, so reported to be a recovering alcoholic. Knowing what I know now, that guy was a dry drunk, which means he was in AA, and you can talk the talk, but not really walk the walk.
Right.
So he was still living a emotionally, spiritually bankrupt life, just going to AA. So I've been exposed to AA when I was a kid, and spent a lot of time around people in recovery. So I kind of knew what it was, but I don't think that I started drinking at 16. I thought I was just doing what everybody else was doing. Um, I think the first time I really saw a problem was when I was working for Eagle Air in Wollaston. And I think my memory is that the weather was not good enough to fly that day or that afternoon, whatever it was. And we got into a case of beer. And I think I drank a lot of the case of beer and I got quite sick. And I was, puking in my bedroom and stuff. And then one of the guys I was flying with, little Jimmy Two Feathers, he come in. I was puking my guts out and he offered me a sandwich. It's like, oh, Jimmy.
Yeah, this will help. Yeah.
And then I started apparently yelling for a nurse. And, the nurse never came because I'm just drunk and I'm hungover and they all think we're idiots, right? So I kind of walked out of that one and I was like, the shame had existed in my life ever since I was a kid, and where it had come from, I don't know. But it built up and built up. And then mostly when I got drunk or got out of hand or did a dumb thing as a result of some element of that process, I always had a shame reaction every time. And then the shame got worse and the shame got deeper. And I would just try to stuff that down and push it away and not look at it. And then that usually, to counter a shame space or a shame reaction, I would try to dominate or make myself look better, or, hey, look at me. And one of the best ways for me to feel better is to make you feel bad. So I would dominate the other guy or try to minimize him relative to me.
So it took the heat off of you.
Yeah, it was always always about making me feel better.
Yeah.
Even if I had to hurt you to do it.
Yeah.
Is I had to get out and up and out of that shame reaction, up and out of feeling less than or worthless. And often the only way I could do it was dominate you.
Did you realize what you're doing at the time?
I don't think so. I think it was years later, like even into the early part of recovery, when you start doing the step work and you start working with the sponsor, is like, and particularly step 4, because you go through step 4 initially and you make a searching and fearless moral inventory of your life. And it's like, and I would say that I believed this at the time too, initially, was that, you get new guys coming in. It's like, they're only thinking about situations that involved my consumption of alcohol, or I was drunk or something like that. The only situations we're really looking at, we just clean those out of the way and we're good. But then you come to realize that what step 4 lays out for you is a pattern of your whole life. And drunk or not, and guys will often talk about this. I'll talk to guys on the phone and they're like, well, I can't be alcoholic because I haven't had a drink for 30 days. Yeah, that does not mean you're not alcoholic. That means you haven't had a drink for 30 days. That's all that means.
Mm-hmm.
But what's going on behaviorally, what's going on in interactions with other human beings, your family, colleagues, everything else, that's where you really pick up the behavioral parts of the addiction. So I don't think that I seriously doubt I realized that at the time. And I have been, in the course of my life, extremely aggressive with other people, trying to feel better. But what that I'm sure you've heard of this Jekyll and Hyde business.
Yep. Yep.
Right? So it becomes this very big swing. It would be, and I was diagnosed as a binge drinker. I could go long periods of time without a drink. But if I got into the drink, we don't need the cap, and you better get out of the way.
One was too many and 1,000 wasn't enough.
Not enough.
Yeah.
Right. And so the way I describe myself is that, while I was still drinking, it's difficult to describe really, but what the AA Big Book talks about is restless, irritable, and discontented. That's the state of being of the alcoholic. And that's present whether I'm currently intoxicated, on my way to getting intoxicated, or stone cold sober on any particular day. I'm still always restless, irritable, and discontented.
The discontent part, is that part of your self-worth then? Is that you just don't like where you are or who you are or what alcohol did to you, so
But I think
you got rid of it every time you drank?
my experience is it roots back, like I said, like pre-alcohol. I think my parents got divorced when I was 8. I don't really have functional memory of what I was like before that. I usually ask my mother questions about what I was like or what I was like to interact with. And my mom will often say that, asking you a question was unlike asking anybody else the same question. You would always get a disproportionate response to the question. And that was even before I took my first drink. So what that is, who knows?
Was there anybody else in your family that were alcoholics?
No, the only, not my immediate family, my dad's mother, knowing what I know now, definitely alcoholic. No question.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, brother, not, mom, no, dad, no. So, and who knows? I mean, and I, like most guys who are listening would probably relate to, I've spent thousands of dollars with a counselor trying to answer the question, why? Why is the wrong question, right? It doesn't matter why. It matters what you're going to do next.
Right.
Right. And so was I born, annoyed?
Were you the 44% genetic is what Brendan would say, right?
Yeah. Like who knows? Right. And maybe.
Yeah.
And there's a school of thought that says the disease skips generations. So if you track that logic, it would skip from my grandmother to myself.
Well, I don't believe in that. My grandmother was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. My brother was an alcoholic.
Yeah. So who knows, right? And you could literally read a zillion books and spend thousands of dollars and still not have an answer to that.
Right.
The question is, what are you going to do now? Once you know that this is what's going on. And so, I was never formally diagnosed as an alcoholic, except for the inherent assessment that goes on in the treatment center. I just self-disclosed, but it was a coerced self-disclosure. It took months to get me to do it, even after I asked for help.
Was there anything during your career that led up to you to go, holy shit, this has got to stop? Was there an incident that started that, or what made you go, okay, enough's enough?
Well, the Reader's Digest version of this, and this is the rough timeline that I share when I present to anybody, is, first drink at 16, that first event at Eagle Air, probably in 92, 93.
And what was that event again?
That was just getting super sick.
Oh, right. Okay.
That. And then I left and went to Com Air, and I say I loved Com Air, but, we drank there. And it was kind of, I didn't think I drank any more than anybody else around me, really, as far as I could tell. But in 1997, so December 31st, 1997, I was flying Sked on the Hawker all day. There was a New Year's Eve party planned for my house in Thompson that night. I got home. I drank a 40-ounce bottle of rum inside of 3 hours by myself.
Oh.
I walked out of that house on my own steam, so in very high tolerance to alcohol. We went to the next house party. I kept drinking. And at some point, I went into a bathroom, and I didn't come out of the bathroom. I collapsed in the bathroom. They had to kick the door in to get at me. An ambulance was called. I do have a brief memory of a paramedic pounding on my chest and a brief memory of being charcoal stomach pumped at Thompson Hospital. And I was released from hospital, and friends were told to wake me up every so often, make sure I wasn't dead. And so the next morning, I woke up with a pretty legendary hangover. But what woke up with me was a depth of shame I'd not felt before. So I didn't know at that point what had gone on.
And how old were you then?
So December 97, I'm 28, I think.
Okay.
20, yeah, we go 28.
Late 20s, okay.
Yeah, and at Comair, like I was training captain on Navajo, King Air, Twin Otter, captain on the Hawker. I think reasonably well respected, and if they had a crap job to go get done, Gracie will go get it done for you. And yeah, like I had the world by the tail. I was well paid, great job, but I was inwardly very not happy. Though I don't know at the time that I really understood that that was the case. And so, I don't know exactly what got back to Comair management, if anything. The only thing I do know that one of my friends that had been present came to me. So what I ultimately decided from this event was that I was starting to have very loose, flickering ideas that maybe alcohol was a problem. Maybe. But I couldn't quite comprehend that just yet. And so, after about 3 days of suffering and receiving the ambulance bill in the mail and all this sort of thing, this sort of increasing levels of shame, I needed a solution. You got to give me a solution. I need out of this situation.
You needed an SOP.
Right. So I phoned a buddy and I said, "Do you think I have a problem with alcohol?" And he said, "No, you just screwed up a little bit." Perfect. That's my out. And 3 days later, I was drinking again. I went back to work, but I couldn't handle being on the flight line. I was quite senior at Comair, I think number 10 on the list by that time. I could have stayed there, but I couldn't handle being on the flight line. You weren't really saying anything to me, but I could tell by the way you looked at me that you were thinking something. And I could not. There was so much shame at that point that I couldn't possibly carry or process anything you had to say. And so I ultimately decided that my problem was not alcohol. My problem was that I lived in Thompson, Manitoba. And so I did what AA calls a geographical cure.
Mm-hmm.
And I applied First Air, and I always wanted to fly in Yellowknife. And applied First Air, got hired as an HX in the Hawker. Two of us went up at the same time, got hired at the same time. And I remember driving to Yellowknife, and I was thinking, okay, you just got to get a life, get a girlfriend, get a hold of your crap, don't drink so much, and everything's going to be fine.
You can say get your shit together if you want.
Okay, good. Get my shit together. And I remember like adamantly believing that that would be true, that I would be okay. That was just a one-up in Thompson. I can get a hold of this. And the first year I was in Yellowknife, so I got there in March of 1998. Yes. And the first year I was in Yellowknife was the last year of my drinking. And it was right off the rocker. New place, new job, scared, anxious, unsure about my suitability for the HX position. Yeah, and into that hole of anxiety and everything else, I just poured more and more alcohol. And of course, I sought out the pilots who I thought drank as much as I did because nobody would notice what was going on. Yeah, we got after it. I drove drunk a lot. I crashed my boat drunk. I was waking up in places that I shouldn't have been. And the way I describe it is that every time I tried to get control of what was going on, it got worse. Or every time I tried to moderate, it got worse. And so, and there were some mornings, like literally flying north in the Sked, I was so physically sick, hungover, I could barely hang on to the column. And I was a really, really bad Jekyll and Hyde captain. Because all the way north, I felt sick, tired, sweating. And I would belittle the first officer bitch out the flight attendant. It was very demeaning to people. And that mood state persisted until one thing happened. And all that happened is we turned Sked southbound. As soon as we were on the Sked southbound, I knew I was going to get a drink. I'd relax. I started to compliment the first officer, chat up the flight attendant. Nobody cares by that point. They're just trying to make it through the day, survive this guy.
Yeah, they're shutting you out already.
100%. And so I think it's the wrong language, but the only way I can really sense it is that because I was an A-check, they were willing to sort of tolerate a bit more, perhaps.
Wonder if that was in the job description.
Right.
Sorry, I had to make light a little bit here.
It's pretty heavy stuff, really, when you get into it, right? And so I thought I was convinced, in fact, by this geographical cure going to Yellowknife, nobody would ever find out about what had happened in Thompson. But one day, a Comair Hawker crew crossed paths with a First Air Hawker crew in Pelly Bay, and the story transferred. And I was confronted by that story in a house party one night in Yellowknife. And shame shot right through the ceiling along with my drinking. And history repeated itself pretty quickly. I had, on this particular day, I went to a house party. And I knew damn well that I had an 8 a.m. check-in. And at 7 p.m. the night before, I started drinking hard liquor. And I didn't quit drinking till about 4 a.m. And eventually I got up. I got to go home, get a little bit of sleep before I go flying. And I went home and I passed out for bed, and I got up, put my flight suit on. I drove to work drunk. I walked into dispatch drunk. Nobody said a word. I walked through the CSAs in the terminal drunk. Nobody said anything. It wasn't until I sat down left seat of the Hawker on the ramp that the first officer showed up. And the first officer sat down and looked at me and said, "I have a problem." Well, I was like, what?
Tell somebody who cares.
Right. And he said, "I can smell alcohol." And I nearly had a stroke sitting right there because I was working on this idea that, insane as it seems to me now, is that I just need one more day and I can sort this out.
Ooh.
And so that was the principle I was operating on. And I don't think sitting in the seat drunk, I had a working understanding of how bad it was. I just need to get this flight done so nobody finds out, and then I can fix it.
Was there any fear at all in knowing that you're going to be operating an airplane intoxicated?
Oh no, you're not even thinking about that. You're just trying to, I know I screwed up by drinking this long. I don't want to book off. I don't want to tell anybody what's going on. I don't think I had any conscious function. I was still drunk.
Yeah.
Right. And so, what we're all capable of when we're drunk, right? All kinds of things seem like a good idea.
And we'll make up stories that make it right. Yeah.
Right. And you'll hear management groups in labor and all over the country talking about, well, if, and CEOs have told me, and they're not wrong. Like, I get the position that puts them in. But the line that I often hear is, well, if you touch the airplane, he's fired. I was like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Like, I get it, but I can't ever advocate for that because I did that. I'll always stand up for a guy, even if he touched the airplane, because, it's like I say all the time, my high school yearbook does not say that I would like to be a raging alcoholic by the age of 29.
Right.
But I was. And in many ways, nobody is more surprised than me. So if a guy touches the airplane or he does something that a management group, because in fairness to them, there's a certain threshold of event where they're kind of stuck, right? Something has to be done. And not to mention the fact that threshold does, potentially come with criminal charges and jail time.
100%. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and this is often what we find from guys they call and they're fearful of, the management group or even us finding out what happened a month ago or 6 months ago when they did this or they touched the airplane. It's like, nobody cares about that at that point, right? It's you're either sticking your hand up or you got found out. If you got caught at the airplane intoxicated at the controls, that becomes complicated quickly. But I did that.
So let's go back to the first officer saying to you, "I could smell alcohol."
Yeah.
Was that a turning point that led you to
No.
recovery?
Well, yes and no. It didn't happen immediately. He scared the shit out of me.
Because he caught you
Well, because he said something,
out loud.
right? And, we've had 2 events at WestJet where the guys made it to the flight deck, and both times the first officer intervened and did the right steps. And both of those captains are out there now flying the line in healthy recovery, right? Nobody's in jail, right? So, those 2 officers I sought out and said, you do realize that at a bare minimum, the courage, I know the courage and how scary that must have been to take that on, but at a bare minimum, you saved the captain's life and you saved his career, right? And I've been in flight schools where the case was presented that said, captain's drinking inside a curfew. It's like, what are you going to do about that? And 50 kids in a 50 kid class said nothing. We're not going to do anything. It's not a big deal. I was like, holy roller.
Where does that come from? Although I think like the generation now, the young kids now, drinking is not a big thing.
No, but that sounds good, but it's not, right? Because drinking's not a big thing, but other things are, right? And there's other drugs. There's coke. There's ketamine, carfentanil, ecstasy, MDMA, all of which is really problematic, not only for the drug itself, but old jiggers like you and me gauging impairment in the flight deck. It's not quite so simple as it is with alcohol. You don't 100% know what you're looking at.
Oh, I never thought. Okay.
Yeah. So
going back to the story again.
yeah.
So he said something.
Well, he said something and I kind of sloughed him. I really didn't like the guy and I sort of sloughed him off in I'm the captain. I sort of tried to dominate that a little bit, partially out of a fear response. And I don't know what I honestly can't remember exactly what I said, but the thing that actually happened is that we were going to Joe Haven, and the Joe Haven weather went out, and the flight got scrubbed. So we both went home. And what I often tell guys is that for whatever reason, he didn't tell First Air Management, and it's not to put more responsibility on him than truly lives with me, but it would have been a lot better for me had he told First Air Management. A lot better. Which sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people, but the fact is that I went home from that flight and I actively tried to get a hold of my drinking, and I tried all kinds of things and was fairly horrified to discover that I could not get a hold of it. Everything I tried made it worse. And the thing that eventually happened was I went out one night to there's a restaurant or bar in Yellowknife, and the purpose of me going out was to prove to myself that I could
See if you could do it.
I could just have 2 beer and go home.
Yeah.
Well, I got home at 2:30 in the morning, pissed as a billy goat, and very unhappy. So like emotionally drained, unhappy, sad. And I still to this day don't know how I had the presence of mind to do it, but I sat on my bed and there was a journal beside my bed, and I wrote in the journal exactly how I was feeling, that I wanted to quit, but I didn't know how and I didn't know who to tell. And I put the journal down and I passed out. And when I woke up, I read the journal and I was like, oh, Jesus, Murphy. Like, so, and, there's a piece missing in there. So all these attempts to get a hold of my drinking after this first officer had said something, and the only thing that ever happened made it worse. I got into a place where, okay, so let's take stock of what's happening. I am flying the line. I'm doing training. I'm doing rides. I'm drinking alcoholically. I cannot stop. I don't know who to tell. I'm pretty sure if I tell anybody, I'm going to lose my career, lose the medical. The only thing that I am is a pilot. Back in those days, it was really important that you find out I was a pilot, but even more important, vital almost, that you find out that I'm an A check, because that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no other identity beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And so all these things being true, I'm like, well, I think I'm screwed. Like I got nowhere to go. And that's when I started to get very strong suicidal ideation. And so now I'm doing all these things. I'm flying the line, doing training, doing rides, drinking alcoholically, actively thinking about killing myself on a daily basis. And that went on for about 2 months. And then this event happened with the journal. And I read the journal and I was still thinking about killing myself. I'm like, holy mother, like, where am I? Like, how did I get here? And the only guy that had come anywhere near me in Thompson was a really close friend of mine. And he said to me, I remember being at his house, and he said to me, so what's it going to be when you go to Yellowknife? You're going to keep drinking? And I looked at him, and this is, post ambulance ride. And I said, there is no evidence that I should stop drinking. And he took a really deep breath and he said, okay. And he, let me go, so to speak. And I went to Yellowknife and all that carnage ensued. But he left Comair and he went to Canadian Airlines.
Mhm.
And I had heard that he had become a pilot assistant. And I didn't have a snifter what that was, but it sounded like something I needed. I don't know what pilot assistance does. So he was the guy that I phoned. Finally, after pacing up and down my trailer for about 8 hours, finally I phoned him and I said, Ron, I think I got a problem with alcohol and I don't know what to do. And he said, okay, well, give me a couple hours. And he got on the phone. This big cloak and dagger operation ensued that I believe involved Dr. Adams and Dave Noble from Air Canada. I was involved in peer assistance, and this guy named Brian Murray trains pilot assistants, or he did back then. And Ron called me back and he said, well, here's kind of what I'm being told you need to do. And one of the first things is you need to go tell the employer. And I was like, are you stoned? I'm not, no,
Are you on ketamine?
that is not, no. And then a guy that a lot of people will know, a jazz guy, retired now, Gord, Big Gord.
Gord Drysdale?
Yeah.
Gordy Drysdale was my very first chief pilot
Was he?
at Southern Frontier
Well,
Airlines.
you will know that he is an enormous human being.
He's
right?
a big man.
And so he called me and he's talking to me. And somewhere in there, I agreed to spend my own money to fly down to Calgary to meet him to go to an AA meeting. I'm like, I don't know, like, what is happening? What is going on?
What? No. What year was this?
99.
99. Okay.
Yeah, spring 99. Well,
So we were still Canadian Regional at the time.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I'd crossed paths with Gordy earlier because I remember him being at Points North, the F-28, with him and Doug Steeney.
Okay.
And so I'd met him way back then. I didn't know anything about him. But anyway, so I fly down to Calgary and I still remember I'd not seen Gord yet.
Did you know who he was?
Well, ballpark knew who he was. Like, he kind of been explained to me who he was and his background and stuff. But I arrive in the Calgary terminal and this enormous human being comes up to me, Gord. He's like, Ian. I was like, maybe. Who the hell are you?
As you looked up at him.
And I remember this, he took me outside and he plopped me in this big caddy and he started driving me away from the airport. And I remember thinking to myself, it's not entirely clear to me that we're going to an AA meeting. I don't know what's going on. But we went to the meeting and I got a big book, the main text for AA. And then I think I spent the night at his house and I went back to Yellowknife the next day. So now what's happening, and you'll hear the AA people talk about this, is that, you got a belly full of booze and a head full of AA, and now you're super screwed, right? Because it's even more confusing. I'm reading the AA big book and I'm drinking while I'm reading the AA big book, and I'm getting further and further confused.
Oh, no.
And Gord would call me. We have these conversations, and then Gord had that company, Runway Survey Company, right? So I got sent out to an ice strip by Arviat with Gord. I wasn't flying. I was offline at this point. I think this was post me telling the company. And I remember standing in the middle of this ice runway and I got his survey stick and I'm looking at it. I didn't even know this guy. Like, what is happening? I'm a hawker captain. But now I'm standing in the ice with a pole with some guy I don't know. Like, what is happening to my life? My life is over. But in the early part of meeting Gord, they pushed me so hard to go and tell the employer. And I was like, no. So all they had told the DFO at First Air and Chief Pilot was that there was a guy in Yellowknife who believed he had a problem with alcohol and he wanted to come in, but I was terrified that I was going to get fired. Terrified. And I came up with all these different reasons, like I had a German Shepherd. I can't possibly go to treatment because I have a German Shepherd, and it's like all this stuff. Yeah,
I got a sore toe.
in one breath, I'm like I'm gonna die, but then they're like my dog and all the rest. So it just went on, and then finally, and I don't even know what happened, but I finally went in to talk to a member of flight operations management. And the guy's office was there. It was all glass windows. And then right across outside the glass windows was the crew assembly area where everybody would show up in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all my buddies are looking at me in the boss's office going, oh, he's in there again. Because I spent quite a bit of time in there for various reasons. And I remember sitting down in front of this flight ops management person. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a stroke. And I said, I think I got a problem with alcohol. And the guy looked back across the desk at me. He said, well, kid, I've been in the program for 3 years. Here's what we're going to do.
Oh, you're kidding.
Was
it kind of like
well, what I tell everybody is that guy saved my life. And it's just like Keith Drake. It's not that he saved my life because he did something magical. He saved my life because he knew what to do. I sure as shit didn't know what to do.
On Brendan's interview, he talks about zebras need zebras.
Yep.
And he was your zebra.
Well, he was extremely well respected on the base, had been around for 10,000 years. I had a ton of respect for him, even though it was the Boeing chief pilot that took care of us. And I remember looking at him thinking, that can't be right. Like, you're one of the most respected people in this entire base. You can't be an alcoholic. But that later on, again, understood why that was true. But yeah, he made me come. I was at a point where I couldn't really see the point of getting out of bed in the morning. Like, what's the point? There's no point. I can't fly. I can't drink. I'm massively confused. And I'm terrified. I was like, what's the point of getting, I know I'll stay in bed, right? But he made me come to his office every morning at 9 a.m. and we would have coffee. And sometimes we'd talk and sometimes we just listen to him breathe. But he gave me purpose every single morning to get out of bed and go somewhere. And he told me that I was loved and that I was valued.
Okay. We need to know his name. Can we use his name?
John.
John?
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. He saved my life.
There you go.
Yeah.
So he was your angel.
Well, it was, when I first came into the program, I didn't believe in God, really. I was raged against Christianity and all that sort of thing, but I always had a sense that there was something, really, but I didn't believe in a defined God. And so now I do, but, still not, I don't believe in church, let's say, but my understanding of God is much different. And so I look back on that and I was like, it's a serious God shot. And I've had hundreds of God shots in my life, if you look at it. So, yeah, I mean, phenomenal human being. And that's how it all works, though. He was there, somebody was there before him, and now I'm here. And then they sent me to treatment in Grand Prairie. And one of the things I talk about when we run our programs is that, self-disclosures are often the biggest fighters. And I was a big, big fighter. Even though I technically self-disclosed, it was a coarse self-disclosure. And even though I'd had a positive reaction from the employer, I was still in control mode. And that's true for, generally speaking, for most people for quite some time. Surrender does not necessarily come immediately. So I went off to treatment and they put you in detox for 3 days. And I distinctly remember laying on this rubber bed in the detox center in Grand Prairie, looking out the window, and I'm sort of, tiptoeing my way through my plan for my life. And this was not in it. How did I get here? Reporting for duty drunk, drinking alcoholically, suicidal ideation, now in a treatment center. Like, what is happening? I'm only 29. And then got into the main part of the treatment and into the program. And I remember sitting down with the director of the place, and he had all these forms. He's explaining how everything works. And I said, well, that's nice and all. That's great. Nice little program you got there. But I'll do this and this and this, but I am not going to group. That's not happening. He's a very nice man, David Nesbitt. He said, he looked at me and he nodded his head and he spun the paper around. He pushed it back at me. He said, sign here. Never did address my declaration about group. And Ian went to group. Ian does not like to be challenged very much. And in group, I got, you're about 6, 8 guys in the room and a counselor. And the counselor locked eyes on me and started coming at me, poking and prodding at this thing and the other thing. And I kept giving him the, go away, piss off kind of thing, in increasing levels of aggression, as I would normally use in my life to get people to get away from me, whether it was friends, family, girlfriends, whatever, get the hell away from me. I tried all that and it didn't work. He kept coming. And so I stood up and I threw my chair across the room and I raged at him for about 10 minutes. And when I got done raging, I was like, huh, what was that about? I wonder.
So there's a lot of shit going through your head and going through.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's when I started to dig into my own recovery. That's when I got fascinated about what sobriety was, what the disease of addiction or alcoholism is and was, and how it works and how it was working in me and all these different pieces. And that's when I dug into the work in the treatment center.
You know what? Let's stop there for a minute. Let's take a break.
Okay.
And we'll come back and we'll get more into the recovery on this.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Flying Minds. If you liked what you heard today, send me a message to chat@flyingminds.com, or you can view our website at flyingminds.com. I'd like to give a shout out to Gracie Graphics for all the work on the logo, and to Evan Baldwin, who can be found at TTV_Valence for his help in editing and website design. All right. Welcome back to Flying Minds. Before we get back into our conversation with Mr. Ian Gracie, if you like the content that we're talking about, or if you have more questions or comments, make sure you send them to chat@flyingminds.com, and I'll be sure to get back to you on that. So, Ian, where we left off here was one thing I'd kind of like to know is, has your sobriety, or how has it transformed your approach to flying or your decision-making process in the flight deck?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think over the course of time, I think one thing that's confusing for people in the beginning is that when it comes to addiction, and in particular, we're talking about my experience with alcoholism specifically, is that, the feeling is that, well, as soon as I quit drinking, I can prove or verify that I haven't had a drink, I'm good to go back to work. And it's like, well, yeah, kind of like we could, if the Transport Canada rules were such and our rules were such that, just because you haven't had a drink in 90 days or 120 days or whatever it is, we can send you back to work, but you're going to get fired for a behavioral problem because you're not okay yet. The mere fact that you just not have consumed alcohol doesn't mean that or any other substance that you may be consuming, doesn't mean that your brain is healed. Doesn't mean that you understand the actual nature of addiction, the nature of alcoholism. And so what we often say, and you hear the guys say, is that alcohol is not the actual problem. So the actual problem is a sort of spiritual disconnection, if you will, right? So I'm not a Christian guy. When I first came into AA, not even a God guy. My relationship with God, as I understand that, in this language described in AA, has evolved over time. And so, yes, I got to get the drink out of the way so I can understand kind of the bigger piece of the issue is this spiritual, disconnection, no sense of self, no sense of ability to interact with other human beings. And so you come to be on a journey of coming to know yourself. One of the things that AA talks about, and it's on some of the coins, is to thine own self be true. which I think is a great phrase, except what if you don't know who you are? And I think that's not an uncommon problem, whether it's Joe Public or a recovering alcoholic addict. We often don't really understand who we are. And so, um, where I'm going with that is that in order, in the world that you and I live in now, we run crews, right? You're first officer, you got flight attendants, you're interacting with CSAs, dispatchers, bosses. These are all human relationships.
Yep.
For an alcoholic or an addict, that's one of the chief things that I have a problem with is human relationships. I don't understand how they work. And, they will say, all the experts have said, and I've said, is that, you stop maturing, and particularly emotional maturing, the day you take a drink, right? So by some argument, I stopped maturing emotionally when I was 16, stopped when I was 29, but there's a 13-year gap in there where I wasn't really keeping up with my peers, not that they're perfect either, but my ability to interact with other human beings, women in particular, I had a very difficult time trusting women. I don't know for sure where that came from. And I've become to the place where I don't really need to know. I just know that's something that I have struggled with over the course of time. And so, um, because if trust is not there, it's partially a fear-based thing. And I think what we talked about before was that when the young guys come into AA or they come into the ARC and the PRP and they go to AA, there's some of the steps talk about character defects, and they start to see themselves, or they get the idea that what AA is telling them is that they're flawed and they're less than because they have all these character defects. But that's not the actual message. The actual message is that everybody on the planet has character defects. It just so happens that in alcoholics and addicts, our character defects kind of get taken to extremes.
In what way?
Well, what's very often has been historically true of me, especially if I've had a shame reaction or a fear reaction, is that I tend to have a disproportionate reaction to the actual problem because I'm not reacting to what's happened in that moment. I'm reacting to something that happened way back here that embedded the fear, embedded the piece of shame, right? And it's all coming out as one reaction. So people would often say that to me is that, they'd ask me a question and I would give this sort of immediate pushback to move you out of the way until I knew I was safe. And then I could look at it more objectively. And then I would give you a more measured response. But unfortunately, when you have that disproportionate reaction on the front end, you damage that human relationship. And that other person tends to step back, or they have a wound that has also been poked because nobody's squeaky clean. So that sort of thing. So this is where
Do you think every time you did that, did it to create more of a wall? Create more?
you mean more a wall between myself and the person I was working with?
No, you're a wall with your own self.
No, I don't think so. I think it's protecting the walls that already exist. I think there's, I mentioned before, like when I got to AA, I literally had no idea that people lived ethics, principled, value-based lives, that they had boundaries, no clue. I didn't know what a boundary was, let alone how to enforce one. And because I didn't know what they were for myself, I couldn't see yours. Even if you told me, hey, I have a boundary here, I just come sailing right over the thing because I don't know what it is.
Is that something that you think you missed learning as a child?
Possibly. Like we were talking about before, right? You could spend thousands of dollars on why. I don't know why. I just know that in the moment, not only from the work in AA and recovery and sponsors and lots of counselors, and I have the gift of having very powerful, you know, depth of wisdom mentors in my life. That's a huge gift. And part of that came from building and running the pilot recovery program and then on to building ARC. But I'm very blessed in the people that I have in my life that reflect back to me with honesty and integrity. It's like, hey, we see this. We love you, but we see this. And I get to go away and work on that and bring that back to people who love me.
Okay, you mentioned PRP. How did you get into that? So you started with WestJet. You got into the program prior to.
Yeah, so PRP at WestJet didn't exist before I got there. So the way this all fits together is that I sobered up March 1st, 1999 is my sobriety date. First air sent me to treatment in Grand Prairie. I came back the line. I flew for first air for about another 3.5 years before they started retiring the Hawkers. And I didn't want to fly the ATR, so I eventually applied to WestJet. So I arrive at WestJet 3.5 years sober. I wait till I'm almost off probation before I start asking questions about pilot assistance teams. And I think I did ask about that in my interview, but I was asking about pilot assistance teams, and I met the pilot assistance chair of the day and sort of met with the team a little bit. And then I remember being in a big meeting and I asked and my memory is that there was HR and labor and a bunch of other people in this meeting. And I said, so what programs is this for guys like me? I'm a recovering alcoholic. And the answer, the response I got was, well, the best thing you can do for an alcoholic pilot is fire him. And I said a series of pretty bad words. And I sort of, I don't know how you want to put it.
Put it the way you want to put it.
I sort of took over pilot assistance at WestJet, became the chair. And when I became the chair, the entire team quit except for one fella, Grant Bestwick, who ironically was the guy that hired me. And we worked on pilot assistance, just the two of us, for quite a long period of time. And then concurrent with that, I approached Dr. Adams about building what I was going to call his pilot recovery program, PRP. And so the history, the lineage of all this work, pilot assistance included, goes back into the States. So late 60s, early 70s, the U.S. Navy was having a lot of trouble with young, highly trained pilots and alcoholism. And so Bart Packle, I believe is the guy's name, is a U.S. Navy doc. I think that's right. Somebody could correct me on that, though. He found a way to rehabilitate these pilots and retain them by the U.S. Navy and put it back to work. And that work eventually got picked up by United Airlines. And then this is where Birds of a Feather came from. And Birds of a Feather is a special meeting of AA for its original intention was aircrew, so pilots.
Birds of a Feather was?
Yeah.
And that started in the States?
Yeah, it started in the States with a fellow named Ward Buckingham.
Okay.
Who was a United Airlines pilot. And at the time, well, even today, the ICAO standard still today says a pilot with a SUD diagnosis is permanently grounded. You never fly again. It's only by virtue of the existence of programs like the one we have and what they have in the States and the relationships with the regulator that the regulator can apply flexibility to that ICAO standard and have a process to send the pilot back to work. So the true history of things is actually the fact that I get to fly airplanes, that I get to retain my career, goes back to the work that the U.S. Navy, United Airlines, Ward Buckingham, the creation of Birds of a Feather, the work that they did in collaboration eventually with the FAA, and created a program called HIMSS, it stands for Human Intervention Motivational Study. I don't even know what that means. But I've been told that not in its entirety, but at least in part, it was named that because at the time, nobody wanted to hear airline pilot and alcoholic in the same sentence.
No, that definitely, you'd never find that in the dictionary.
Right? Which is largely still true, unfortunately, in many respects. And aviation has its own bias and its own stigma in many avenues of the structure. But so that lived in the States for a long period of time. And it wasn't until 1983 where Dave Noble, who's a captain Air Canada, Brian Murray, who by trade is an Anglican priest, but also a marriage and family therapist, and another Air Canada pilot named Harry Kent. Those are the guys those three guys came together, and fundamentally, they are the creators of pilot assistance work in Canada. And they brought that fundamental approach that HIMSS had created in the States across the border in 1983, primarily focused on the Air Canada pilots for obvious reasons, but it only really ever existed as a gentleman's agreement between Air Canada and Transport Canada about how these cases were going to get managed.
Okay. So
So
Transport Canada kind of gave them
yeah, like
a way out.
they endorsed, they took that approach, the HIMSS approach, and as it was, I'm guessing here, adapted to the way Air Canada operated at the time to provide a framework that satisfied what transport needed to offer that regulatory flexibility and send the guy back to work.
Right.
So when they sent the guy back to work, it was on a restriction, which the restriction says as or with a co-pilot. So for the vast majority of us, it's no big deal. You're two crew already.
Yep.
Right? Doesn't matter. But there's not a pilot on the planet, myself included, that likes to have a restricted medical. Even if the restriction fundamentally doesn't change anything about what's happening in their career, they don't like it. I didn't like it either.
Right.
So that's the framework that had existed in Canada. That's the exact framework that helped me when I stuck my hand up at First Air. That's how it all played out. But when I got to WestJet in 2002, like say, so now we're into butting up against 2003 when I start making these moves, running pilot assistance, building PRP. And the first place that Dr. Adams sent me was a guy named Dale Anderson. I'll get shot for not remembering that.
Dale, don't shoot him.
Dale Anderson was a long-time Air Canada captain who'd been doing this work for a long period of time. And Doc Adams sent me direct to Dale. And I still remember sitting over there by COP with Dale at a picnic table saying, so I'm going to build an addiction program for WestJet. What does this all look like? And I got the gift of all of that guy's wisdom. And then he cobbled up some documents that he'd found from the old Air Canada system. And then I went on the hunt and I got program documents from Delta Airlines, United, Canadian Regional, Canadian Airlines, Air Canada, I think somebody else. Anyway, big heap of paper at my house in Tuscany at the time. And I'm like, holy mother, like, I wonder if I know what I'm doing. And just started to write the document, the master document for the program, build up the structure based on my own experience, all these different programs, what had worked, what hadn't worked, some of the HIMSS experience. And at the time we weren't ALPA, right? So there's an absolute wizard in the States named Dana Archibald, who's a former HIMSS chair, ALPA guy, American Airlines pilot, retired now, but he's one of my best friends in the world. And he was really giving and supportive of what we were doing. But there came a limit, in fairness to ALPA and to him, that some of that was proprietary to ALPA and they didn't really want to share it at that point, which was fine. But I said, I started to write this document and I work at it and work at it and work at it. And like, I work at it at home, I work at it in layovers, I work at it in the flight deck. And I remember we were still building the structure and putting it together when I got a phone call. And it was a WestJet pilot. So the company was calling about this WestJet pilot because I think I was working away at the office for a bit, and Ernie Bile, who was the ops manager at the time.
I know Ernie very well. Hello, Ernie.
So this guy got in trouble and he drank inside curfew in Kelowna during a layover and got reported. So they pulled him offline, brought him back to Calgary, and they terminated his employment, but they held the termination in abeyance pending whether or not he would accept help from us. So Ernie came and found me and said, here's the deal. Here's the situation. Can you help him? I was like, yep. If he wants help, we can help him. Guaranteed. So
something you just said, though, is if he wants help.
If he wants it.
Yeah. That's very important.
Yeah. And in the beginning, lots of people don't want it. Lots of people are in fight mode, and that's fine. We're trained to deal with that. I was a fighter, right? I was the guy, like I was talking about, I came back from treatment. My medical came back category 1 restricted. So I was going back to work on a Hawker 2-career airplane. Everything's golden. Nope. I'm not happy about this restriction. So I created a holy war over this restriction. My boss let me do it. And I called the Civil Aviation Tribunal. All these lawyers coming from Toronto to Yellowknife. And I am madder than a hornet. I just want this restriction gone, because what if I want to go do a single otter contract? I haven't flown a single otter in years, but suddenly out of the blue, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then one day, the regional aviation medical officer in Edmonton, he's passed away now, Dr. Jay Danforth, he called. And he said, "So how's it going?" And I ranted at him for 5-10 minutes about this restriction being bullshit. And the only reason you people know anything about me is because I told you, and it's going to be my way, and this is how it's going to go. And this tribunal is you're going to get your what for. And he listened to the whole thing. And then he said, "So you're not going to win, right?" And I raged for another 5 minutes. And he listened to the whole thing, right down to the last drop. And then he said, "So you're not going to win, right?" I was like, "Fine. Forget it then. Just cancel the tribunal." And I did the weirdest thing I've ever done in my life. I got up from that phone call. I went to an AA meeting. I found myself a sponsor. I started doing step work. I was madder than a hornet, but I was doing the work. And then about a year and a half later, Danforth calls me back and he says, "How's it going?" I said, "Honestly, I don't know. I'm confused most of the time. I don't understand some of this. I'm still kind of mad, but I'm doing the work. I got a sponsor and doing the steps. I am marginally feeling better." And he goes, "Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to take the restriction off your license now. See you later." So he's just waiting for me to calm down. Stop fighting. Just surrender. Just do it. It'll work. Right. So I get into building this program at WestJet. I have all these mentors around me. I can literally pick up the phone and find any mentor any time of day, and they answer the phone and answer my stupid questions. And this guy had gotten into trouble in Kelowna, and so he was in a hotel in Calgary. And I remember driving, I lived in Airdrie at the time. I was driving to this hotel in Calgary, and I had an AA big book with me, and I'm driving to the hotel, and I don't have a snifter what I'm going to say to this guy. Like, not a clue. Like, he's fired. And the only way the firing is going away is if he accepts the help of PRP, but it's essentially a fledgling program. I got lots of mentors, lots of resources, but I think I'm the guy. I'm the more or less self-appointed chair, 4.5 years in recovery. And I drive to this hotel and I walk in this guy's hotel room and he's, deer in the headlights. He's scared.
How old was he?
He'd probably shoot me, but I think 35, 40,
okay,
somewhere.
Yeah. He was probably 30.
Probably, or 20 even. And I walked in, so I was talking to him, and then at some point, I'm standing by the door. He's kind of half, 3/4 of the way across the room toward the window. And I start talking to him and telling him about, look, here's the situation you're in. Here's the process. Here's next steps. And at the end of the day, I know it's terrifying. I know that in many levels, you're probably quite confused, but, really what I need you to remember is that I love you and I care about what happens to you.
You said that to him?
Yeah.
You'd never met him before?
No.
What was his eyeballs?
Well,
how big were they?
Two things happen. One is I'm positive he got closer to the window. And the other is I said to myself, who the hell said that? I don't talk like that. Who said that?
Oh, so it just came out.
It just came out. And it was part and parcel of what was starting to happen in my own life, my own way of being, is that, hey, I have the capacity to share openly and honestly and in a loving, supportive manner with another human being.
That's called compassion.
Yeah, I didn't have that before, don't think.
Good for you, Ian.
Right?
We're talking about compassion now. I like it.
And so anyway, I left him there and I went home and I started the mechanics of bringing the pieces forward. And the pilots get sent to a substance use assessment. So he went to that, came back as, yes, in fact, you are alcoholic, chemically dependent under the DSM-4 at the time. And that guy's out there right now flying the line. Has been for, I'm 26 years sober. He's got to be, I don't remember what year that was now, but now 2000, he's got to be 20 years sober. And he's one of the most remarkable men on the planet. And he went through a series of transformations that were even amazing to me. And one of the things that happened along the way, it's so weird, is that he became a Bikram yoga teacher. And then years later in 2010, I was struggling at the end of a relationship and I was kind of pissed off and I wasn't really going to AA and I was fighting everything. And he it took him a while, but he negotiated me into one of his Bikram yoga classes. So we're talking 40 degrees Celsius, 40% humidity, super hot,
I love those.
right? And I made this other pilot come with me, dragged him in there. And I'll never forget this because I didn't know what to expect. And there's these big mirrors, and then we're all laying there in this dark room, and then this guy walks in the room, and boom, all the lights come on. And I sit up, and there's my buddy, and all he's got on are these little tiny shorts. I'm like, what is happening? A little heads up on that would have been good. And then I get into this Bikram yoga class, and I hate it. Absolutely hate it.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of things that happen in Bikram over the course of time. But at the end of the class, he's like, what do you think? And I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to punch you in the face. Like, what was that about? But the strange thing that happened is I hated it. And the next day I was right back in the room. He wasn't there. I came on my own accord, paid my money, went back in the hellhole, and I kept doing that. And as I did it, more and more sort of epiphany started to happen for Ian, and situations that I would normally handle in kind of an antagonistic manner, I got these ideas about handling it differently. And I thought, well, that's crazy. That's the polar opposite of what I would normally do. But I went and tried it, and it worked. I was like, well, that's fascinating. So somehow or another, I wound up at Bikram Yoga teacher training in Los Angeles in 2012, 9 weeks. And I taught my first class on that guy's sobriety date with him in the room. Now, I tell people all the time, if you had told me 26 years ago when I was drinking myself to death in the Arctic that I was going to be a yoga teacher, I was like, you, my friend, are stoned.
That's right. You were on ketamine. Yeah.
So,
oh my.
You don't know. And this is one of the beautiful
So it's
things.
very cathartic, obviously.
Hugely cathartic.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things I tell guys in the beginning is like, I know right now, most of everything around you is on fire. I get it.
Yeah.
Right. That's not going to last forever. You are, you have a big, beautiful life full of joy, love, laughter, and adventure coming for you if you do the work. Guaranteed.
So from the PRP, which you started, which you're not doing anymore, but you're part of the program, I'm sure.
Well, I am still doing it, just not. I'm no longer the chair at the West
chair.
Jets.
Okay,
yeah.
But you are now part of ARC, which is Aircrew Recovery Canada.
Yeah. So what happened there is that so I established PRP at WestJet in 2003. Let's say, for argument's sake, I ran that until 2013, and I struggle a little bit with politics and some of that stuff, pilot representation pieces that I don't fully understand. But am working to improve at those things. And I was in, so 2013, I'm now 14 years sober. And I was in St. John's, Newfoundland on a pairing. And we were about to depart to go to Halifax. And unfortunately, I don't remember who this first officer was. I wish I could, because he's owed an apology by me. Because I took a phone call about some funding that didn't go very well right before departure. So funding for PRP. And I got in the airplane and I was stewing all the way out to the runway. And from gear up to gear down in Halifax, I ranted like a madman about how pissed off I was about this whole thing. And I was taxiing in Halifax. And I thought, this is not very good. This is not where I want to be in my life. And this is not, this sort of overinvestment in what happens or doesn't happen isn't really doing anything good for me.
Right.
And so I got back to Calgary and I got on the phone. I started asking some questions to kind of explain what was going on for me. And one guy said to me, it's like, well, you're probably just going to have to do this work forever. And I quit 20 minutes later. And I stepped down as the chair with no warning. It was not the way to do it. And it was not good for anybody. And fortunately, somebody stepped up into the chair role. But I just completely got away from all the program stuff, doing any monitoring or any program management at all. I just left.
May have been a little bit of overload, right?
Oh, a huge overload.
Yeah.
And
At some point, you got to look at yourself and go, okay, this overload is not good for me.
well, it's not good for me, but it's also not good for anybody else I'm trying to work with, right?
Yeah.
It's highly unfair to the people around me. So, um, and I didn't have some of the things in my life that I wanted, like a relationship and all those, and go play things weren't present because I was always doing this stuff. And so I went away and I tried some dating and I tried climbing and I went to a Baptist yoga teacher training in Hawaii that was very powerful for me in March of 2014. And then July of that year, I went up and hiked Ellesmere Island for 2 weeks with a company called Black Feather. And on that trip, I met a woman that I ended up, we shared 5 years together. We're engaged at one point. That ultimately that relationship did not work out. Um, and you don't know what you think about what's going to happen down the future, but she was killed last year in a plane crash in Albany. So these things that have sort of happened, you know, I was trying to figure out who Ian was outside of PRP because it was starting to be just like I described with the airplane. My whole identity was I'm PRP. I'm the chair. I run this thing,
You
right?
didn't know who you were. And
I was starting to lose track of me again,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, which is not at all recovery. So
Yeah.
I went away and did these things, and I've discovered some things about myself that I didn't know and things that I enjoyed doing. And I was trail running and hiking and all these different things. And, my ex and I did some amazing hikes in, Greenland and Iceland and high Arctic and all that kind of stuff. Just brilliant stuff, right? It was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but, um, and then we unionized in 2017.
2017 is when I started
I
it.
believe, yeah.
Encore.
And so we unionized 2017, and unfortunately, there was a bit of disturbance in the force between the company and the union. And one of the things that got clipped by that was the PRP system. It got dragged into a little bit of politics. And so the union asked me to come back and run PRP again. And I initially refused, but then I came back because I was getting more and more concerned about the program being damaged. So I came back and created what's called PRP Advisory Board at WestJet. And that's got flight ops, labor, legal, HR, uh, PRP leadership, and some union representation on it as well. And said, look, we cannot afford to damage this program. Like pilot health, pilot well-being is being clipped and affected by the bickering that's going on between the company and the union. This has to stop.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought them together at one table and I said, look, this is in essence, a neutral table. Runs on AA principles. And one of the most important parts of that principle is rigorous honesty. We're rigorously honest with each other. And even I didn't realize the power that that board held until we really started digging into the work. And, there was lots of, fighting, essentially bantering back and forth. And occasionally I have these little epiphanies, and I was bantering back and forth with this lawyer. And I was annoying him. He was annoying me. Back and forth it was going. And suddenly I got this thought, and the thought that came said, ask him what he needs. So I said, well, okay, so, let's put all this down for a second. What is it that you actually need? And he told me. I thought, oh, that's actually quite reasonable. That makes a lot of sense. How do I get you what you need and not blow up PRP? And then I started doing that with the other groups. And then by evolution of conversation and trust, they started to ask us what we needed. And the whole thing is absolutely brilliant, and it works extremely well.
Amazing what happens when you have honest interaction with people.
Right? So that we got that settled down. The program's functioning fine. And in 2019, I had been chirping for years about the need for a national addictions program in Canada. There'd never been one. So the HIMSS in the States been around for 5 decades.
All relating to aviation.
Yep. HIMSS is purely aviation addiction for pilots.
Yep.
And there'd never been a national addiction program for pilots in Canada, ever. So I've been chirping around that. And then the other thing that fed into that was the Carson air crash in 2015 in Vancouver. So it was the Metroliner, 2 pilots on board, left Vancouver going to Fort St. John. and they pretty rapidly disappeared off radar into the North Shore Mountains. And they found the wreckage in the near vertical position. The accident report is very interesting, but the TSB came along and essentially said three possible things. One is either pilot incapacitation, pedostatic blockage, or an intentional act. And they cited two reasons for an intentional act, one of which is the accident happened right on the heels of Germanwings, which they found.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like right on the heels. It was, I think Germanwings was March 24th, 2015, and this crash was April 15th, I think, if I remember correctly. But they came along and they said pilots with substance use disorder are 60 to 120 times greater risk of suicide. And when you read the report and you see the talk screen that they did on the captain, 0.24. Ooh, that's hours after the accident, right? 0.24. So
and what's the legal is 0.0?
Well, no, it's like most drug and alcohol policies in Canada now, 0.00 is the threshold.
Right.
Driving is 0.08, but there's different thresholds. Technically, 000 is indefensible legally because there's 1,000 reasons that, a SoberLink device could register more than, or even a blood test could register more than.
So hours later, obviously they had to get crews up there. They had to recover the bodies and then do the toxicology on them. Hours later, it was still 0.24.
Right. So my point with all of that, and I present these slides wherever I present, and this is really important to communicate to anybody who's listening to this is not a failure of Carson Air. This is a failure of Canadian aviation, right? So this kid's in there, 0.24, and so you go through and they lay out what 0.24 is supposed to produce is confusion, dizziness, staggering gait, slurred speech, moderate muscular incoordination. But chronic heavy drinkers often show functional tolerance, right? So this guy, same as me.
Is that what they call a high functioning alcoholic?
No, that's another phrase that
I don't like the term of that phrase.
Well, it's not really valid at the end of the day. It's a rationalization people make.
Oh,
I'm a high functioning alcoholic.
So it allows them to drink more.
You're an alcoholic. End of story.
End of story.
So he same as me. So I did mine in 1999. This guy does his in 2015. 16 years later, the same thing is still happening. History just keeps repeating itself. He walked into dispatch, interacted with people on the ramp, got into a Metro flight deck, which is much smaller than a Hawker flight deck, which means that FO is even closer to him.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody noticed anything. And that's what happens. You got very high tolerance. Functionally, you can just, operate, even though you got huge amounts of alcohol on board, as if you're not.
And what was the final outcome of the TSA report?
Well, what came out of that report was that the TSB recommended that.
Or TSB, sorry, I said TSA.
Yeah. So
you knew what I meant.
So many acronyms. BC. They recommended two things. One is that the DOT work with industry to create a comprehensive substance abuse program for pilots, and that there be an increased level of drug and alcohol testing. So the only thing that's happened is Garneau's office at the time went to Washington. They collaborated with the FAA and they came up with increased drug testing, but it's primarily for people already identified and participating in these programs. So the PRP testing increased along with ARC. There's much more testing going on now than what there used to be.
Is there a human rights thing associated with that where people could say, no, you can't do that? Or?
Well, the only threshold in Canada that I know of is really a lawyer question, but the only threshold that I work with is that if you're diagnosed as having SUD, that becomes unannounced testing, which is completely legal and required. What you can't do in Canada is random drug testing. You can, I'm told, in a very narrow legal band, but I'm not the guy to define that band. You need a lawyer, aviation lawyer, to get into that. But random testing.
So no company does random testing?
No, it's illegal.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
So you were the one that kind of went down that road and started Air Crew Recovery Canada then?
Well, what happened was yeah, like I said, uh, the Alp Canada Board asked me to come and present about the concept of a national program. And so I presented to the Canada Board in Victoria, June of 2019. Said, here's the idea, here's the name, here's the whole process, here's why. And then that was adopted by resolution September of 2019 in Halifax, with myself as the chair. And then we set upon building that initially as an ALPA project. But in about 2022, 2023, it dawned on me that that couldn't stay an ALPA entity. In the States, the HIMSS program is funded by an FAA grant managed by ALPA. It's not an ALPA program, it's an FAA program, right? And ALPA does a masterful job of doing all of that. The work the guys do in the States is unreal. In Canada, it became apparent to me fairly quickly that there's no circumstance in which you're going to get federal money into a program owned by a trade union, right? So what we did was we lifted ARC up and out as a standalone not-for-profit, which it is now.
Mm-hmm.
ALPA, and I heard this on Doc Adams' podcast as well, and he's quite right. ALPA has been phenomenal in the level of support to both PRP and ARC. And so they're continuing to fund ARC until it's self-sustaining because they recognize the importance of a national system being in place, best practices, all, access to all the wizards, et cetera. And best practices and government discussions then feed down into, so having taken ARC away from ALPA, so to speak, we're now implementing pilot recovery programs, so PRP systems at each of the ALPA Canada properties in Canada. So that's a huge undertaking that's going to take years to do.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what exists. ARC is a national program for all pilots in Canada, whether you're first day flight school or some old half dead retired guy. The point of
Don't
ARC.
look at me like that when you say.
Well, I'm looking at you, but I'm thinking about Brendan.
Oh, Brendan, here we go.
Here we go. You got to bash Brendan. Kind of the point of that, and Brendan spoke about this too, which is a critical component of what this is all about, is that had Carson Air known that they could pick up the phone and call us, that would probably have had a different outcome, right? Because people at Carson Air knew, they suspected this guy had a drinking problem,
Yeah,
but nobody did anything.
that's sad.
Right. And this is a common problem throughout. It's a problem for WestJet still. It's a problem for Air Canada. It's a problem for all the carriers in Canada. I see it almost daily. People will say, well, yeah, we kind of think this guy's drinking too much, but I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get the guy in trouble. I can't reinforce enough. This is not about getting the guy in trouble. It's not about ending his career. At a bare minimum, this is about saving that individual's life.
Yeah.
Then we'll worry about the career.
Right.
Right. Because I often hear people say is like, well, this and that, I'm not sure. And it's like, listen, if you don't really know what you're looking at, you got to pick up the phone, because if you don't, you could literally kill the guy. And we have had 2 alcohol related suicides in the last 8 months.
Well, I think that's one of
right.
the.
And in one case, I discovered that people knew that he was drinking like that, but nobody told us. That is the most mad I've ever been since I've started running this stuff.
It's one of the reasons why I started this podcast.
Yeah.
Is because I heard that.
Yeah.
Well, if you could go back and talk to your younger self at the height of your struggles, what would you say to him?
It's interesting you say that, because this, as I was reflecting on that question, this came up a while ago in a different conversation. And I think it was not specifically targeted at addiction, but one thing I would go back and tell myself is that you're loved. You matter. You're loved.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that. Right. And it's very often I've seen pilots, myself included, reduced to tears when somebody keeps saying, you're loved, you're worthy, you matter. Because at the end of the day, it's not about us being pilots. It's about us being human beings.
Exactly.
Men and women, right?
Yep.
The greatest advice I ever got in this whole process was from a jazz guy in recovery. And he said to me one day, I was early in, and he said, Ian, I used to be a pilot, and now I'm just a guy that flies airplanes. And at the time, I will tell you, I don't snifter what he was talking about. I didn't get it,
Mm-hmm.
but I get it now,
Mm-hmm.
right? My whole identity is not defined by, I haven't been a training captain in 10,000 years, right? I don't need to be a training captain. I don't need to be an HEC. I don't need to be any of those things. I know who I am. I'm very passionate about this stuff, but one of the most important lessons I learned as I build this program is to write myself out of the script. One of the WestJet managers said it at a course one day. He said, Gracie right now is the single point of failure, right? So you have to build a system that is built by the community for the community, that the next generation can take on. The guys that come after me, I'm about 9 years out from retirement from WestJet.
Mm-hmm.
Will I keep doing this work in retirement? Perhaps. But actively writing myself out of the script, establishing chairs at each of the Alpa Airlines, sharing that collective community knowledge, my wisdom, my experience with them, mentoring them up so they can take it on and take it over so I'm not required. And what I have to tell the young guys too is I have a bid in on the 787, but I don't need to fly the 787. If I retire on 737, that's fine with me. Don't matter. It'd be cool to fly the 87, but no part of me or my identity or I don't need any of that. And I love that that's true now.
It must feel real good.
Feels really good. Like, if money was different, I'd retire today and I'd be happily entertained for the rest of my days.
Yeah.
Right?
Do lots of hiking.
Lots of hiking. Find some joker that'll let me fly a twin otter on floats. But
Start a Bikram yoga studio.
oh, good Lord. You know what I say about that is it'd be great if you didn't have to hire yoga teachers. And it's like, same as an airline. An airline would be great if you didn't have to hire pilots.
Yeah.
It'd be perfect.
Well, there's people trying to work on that right now.
Yeah, no, we don't want that.
So I've got a question here. I'm going to make this our parting question. Okay. And it's, well, we'll see how you take it. How do you continue to cultivate a life that's lived and not restricted in your sobriety? And what's next for you in this journey?
That's a deep question, isn't it? One of my chief fears about way back in the beginning about telling anybody what was going on is that I felt that my life would be over. I was 29. How am I going to have a relationship sober? How am I going to have sex sober? How am I going to dance sober? How am I going to do anything sober? It's like my life is going to be completely and utterly soul sucking. There's going to be no joy in my life. And this is an alcoholic talking, where my whole life is on fire. My finances are on fire. I can't keep a relationship together to save my life. And I'm an unholy nightmare to be around, mostly an unholy nightmare to myself. So one of the things that AA talks about, and it's in the book, it says, alcoholics are the only people I know that have to think about whether they want to live an alcoholic life of destruction or try the AA program and live a spiritual life. Right? So, guys that are in the program, they're in the program. If you're moderate severe side or you're alcoholic, you're in the program for 5 years, 5-year monitor, right? And they sometimes will talk about, I only need to do this for 5 years and I can just stop. Yep. You can if you want your life to go back to where it was. So my life now, if you'd sat me down with a piece of paper and entered treatment and said, write out your best life, I wouldn't have come even remotely close to the life that I've lived in those years. Have those years come without problems, without heartache, without pain? No. Right? But I still go to meetings, on average 3 meetings a week. I still have a sponsor. I still do step work. I am of service through PRP and ARC. I hike, I trail run. I keep growing, keep trying to grow. I think really one of my, like I said, I'll fly to WestJet till 65. I'll retire. Maybe I'll do some flying, God willing, and medical permitting at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel that I am, as the jazz guy said, I'm just a guy that flies airplanes. And the totality of me is not defined by that anymore. So I look ahead at retirement. I'm like, okay, so how can I continue to be of service? Because that's a core part of my recovery. Perhaps doing this work, perhaps a consulting business, recovery coaching.
What about Ian though?
That is Ian.
What about just going out, join Ian?
Well, yeah. Running, hiking, trekking, trail running, continuing to grow. When I say continuing to grow in service, is continuing to grow in community with people.
There you go.
Right.
That's part of the whole ikigai.
Yeah.
Purpose. You have to have purpose.
Well, you must.
And
yes, absolutely.
As long as you have purpose and you do all those things that you like to do.
I tell the flight school kids, and I think I told the Encore guys when I was presenting to them, is like, look, if you come on the jet and we level off at 40,000 feet and the first thing you do is pull out a flying magazine, I'm going to be like, Mary, Mother of God, tell me you're interested in something else. Because I don't want to talk about airplanes for 14 hours. I sure as shit don't want to sit and watch you read the contract for 14 hours.
Yeah.
I want to know what lights you up. What brings you passion?
Yeah.
What are you into outside of this airplane? Because given the opportunity, this industry, the airlines, and it's not that they're vile, it's just that they're designed to get the most out of you.
Yeah.
You're not duty bound to give them all of you. Like, who are you? What lights you up? Is your life full of love, laughter, adventure, and joy? And if it's not, find out why.
Yeah. 100%. So I think let's leave off right there.
Okay.
Love, laughter,
adventure,
and joy. So anybody that's listening to this, that's what you should strive for. Thanks again, Ian, for joining me on Flying Minds.
Thank you.
It's been a fabulous conversation, very an eye-opening conversation for me. And I think we're just going to have to get you back here because I know this conversation we could continue. And we're already at 2 hours. So
yeah, anytime. It was really it was a gift for me to be able to talk with you and share with you. And I'm fascinated by the questions and the perspective and the discussion. So I'm happy to come back anytime.
Awesome. Thanks again. And thank you, listeners. If you like the content, chat at flyingminds.com. Send me a message.